Okay, George, welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. This week we have with us Dr. Stephanie Mapp. How did you get in contact with Stephanie?
Well, I posted on one of the Facebook groups about people who have had fee-for-service practice acquisitions, and I was really looking for somebody who didn't have a great experience. And I think it's really hard to find somebody who did not have a good experience to get on air and talk about
Yeah.
it. And so,
Oh, I mean, that's like the problem with Dentaltown and StudentDoctor.net and online forums and Facebook groups. The people who are super successful are very quick to talk about their success and why it all went a certain way. And people who've had a really hard time, and often for reasons out of their control, are not as loud and vocal and boisterous. So you get a very biased perspective of what success looks like and what's normal if you kind of live in certain online communities. So and this, like, I'm super excited to have these three interviews back to back, because in my mind, like, there is two sides of the Shared Practices podcast. One side is the technical knowledge and know-how and understanding, and the other side is the actual experiences of dentists who are out there. And so the fact that Dr. Mapp was able to get on and share kind of the highs and lows of her journey, I was really excited about.
yeah, and I wanna kind of fill in the audience on maybe her background, and you'll hear it as we go through the interview. But I just think it's important to kind of start with it. So she, 16 years ago, did a startup, and that was a fee-for-service startup. And so that was successful until the recession hit. It's still successful, but she had a drop off in the recession. She had to end up signing up for some insurance plans, and so she was no longer fee for service. And then 5 years ago, she decided to buy a second practice to try to make up some of that income that she had lost in both maybe decreasing the size of her practice and switching to a PPO practice.
Sure.
And so the episode talks about her experience buying that second practice, which was a fee for service practice. And that's kind of the whole gist of it. But I wanted you guys to kind of get that background up front so that it could help you go as you go through it.
No, that definitely helps, because sometimes when you're listening to this the first time and then you like hear a small detail and then you miss it and you're like, okay, wait, which practice came first? So that was really helpful.
And then I wanted to make a note. Richard and I kind of joke about it. I don't think I have a great voice for being on a podcast. And I've never been, I've been very public about that whenever asked. But actually we got to the interview and she told me, like, I see why people listen to you. You have a nice voice. And I was like, are you
Nice.
serious? You think that? And then she said that I have an NPR voice. So as you go through this, just think of me on NPR as, some well-spoken NPR guy, and that'll help you get through my voice on other episodes.
Well, the ironic part is that over this holiday break, so I was in Indiana with my in-laws, and my mother-in-law, who's like a vocal performance person, was like, she happened to hear a clip of the podcast. She's like, who's that other person? She's like, yeah, he definitely does not have a voice for radio. So, just kind of take it in check. But now I've just realized, as you were saying this, NPR is filled with like characters that don't have the most obviously like beautiful type voices. Like, they're kind of different voices. So maybe you do fit that. Maybe you really do have an NPR voice where it's like intelligent, a little bit like different, so you remember it, but then like good, and you can walk people through things. So I'm going to stick with it. You've got the NPR voice, George.
Oh, so I guess it wasn't a compliment. Oh, I just got it. Oh man, that's funny.
It's a backhanded compliment.
All right. Well, then my opinion has not changed. I have an NPR voice. All right.
Perfect.
All right. Well, then we'll go to the interview, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy this one. I have with me here today Stephanie Mapp. And Stephanie, she bought a fee-for-service practice, and I posted on one of the Facebook groups about people who had experiences buying fee-for-service practices for these episodes, and she was kind enough to respond and then ultimately agreed to an interview. And so I think she has an interesting experience today that I hope our audience can learn from. And so I'll go ahead and let her introduce herself, and then we'll hop right in. How are you doing today, Stephanie?
Good.
I appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience. Why don't you go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background? And
Okay, I'm a dentist in a suburb of Jacksonville, Florida. I've been a dentist since 1994, and I have done a startup practice from scratch, which is almost 16 years old. And I bought a fee-for-service practice, which was a second location that I had for 5.5 years.
Okay, so you had that practice for 5.5 years, the fee-for-service practice?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start with the startup then. We'll briefly talk about that one. So you started the practice, and what made you want to get a second one? How'd it go? How large is that first practice? And
My first practice, I opened in 2002, and that was a startup practice from scratch. And it was in a location where there was a lot of growth, but not a lot of dentists. And we were fee for service at the time that I opened the practice, and it expanded very quickly. And I ended up doubling my square footage right before 2007. And the first part of 2007, we were rocking and rolling. We were collecting over $100,000 a month. And I was doing that entirely on fee for service. Minimal advertising, but I still was consistent with my advertising. I did direct mail, and I grew the practice. It became profitable very quickly. And then after the recession hit, we started bleeding patients, and our revenues kept dropping and dropping. And we started losing a lot of patients who previously were willing to pay their $5, $10, $12, whatever it was, their difference in the full fee price and the PPO price. So we started to quickly realize, gosh, we have to get on some of these plans, because when you take a 30 to 40% revenue cut, you have to stop and say, what is it we need to do differently to try to grow the practice again? And it just was not growing. It was stagnant. And so I started looking for a different revenue source to make up for the income that we had lost as a result of the decline after the recession. So that's when I started looking for a second practice.
okay, so you looked for the second practice as a way to, were you the only provider in your first practice, or did you have another dentist with you?
I had another dentist with me, and I started the practice on my own, but then I had another dentist in the practice, and then that dentist left, and even the other dentist had to go seek another source of employment, because we just weren't making the numbers we were prior to the recession. So when that dentist left, I said, you know what, I'd like to have a second location, try to get some numbers from somewhere else. And I sought out, and I waited quite a while before I found the right practice to purchase.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that practice then. So was your plan going into that second location that you would work out of two, or would you hire another associate and then you guys would kind of alternate between the two?
My plan was to have two dentists alternating. I focused more on cosmetics and orthodontics. I didn't enjoy endo. I didn't enjoy surgery. So my goal was to find someone that liked to do those things, and then we could alternate services at both locations. So that was the plan.
Okay, so now let's go through it. So then you go and you find the second practice. So what kind of things were you looking at in assessing that opportunity?
I was looking for a practice in a great neighborhood, which is what I found. I was looking for a practice where I thought it was being underutilized, which is what I found. And I was looking for a practice that basically was not in network with insurances. So I found all of those. The practice I purchased was doing around $500,000 a year it had been there for 8 years, and they were only working one doctor chair and one hygienist. So the thoughts were, it's a small staff, low overhead. It was much lower overhead than my original practice. And I thought, well, it wouldn't take much to turn this in from a $500,000 practice to a $700,000 or $800,000 practice, and this should be pretty easy. So that was my thought process at the time.
And were you still fee for service at your first location, or at this point, this was like around 2012, I'm assuming? Is it at this point did you accept insurance at the other location?
At my other location, we had to go PPO because we just couldn't make it as a fee for service practice. So we did slowly gain more and more PPO contracts. And this was by 2011 that I purchased the second location, because evaluating my numbers from the time that I had been a fee-for-service office, and my revenues actually stayed stagnant, but the number of procedures I did increased by about 25%. So I was doing more work for no additional income. And so that's when I said things have kind of got to change. So that's why I was on the hunt for a fee-for-service practice.
Okay, so your first practice, you had kind of the good life before with the fee-for-service, and then you started becoming, more PPO patients, and you started accepting plans. And then at that point, that's why you wanted to find another fee-for-service practice to buy.
Exactly. What happened, in addition to the recession, which hit our area very hard, we also had an increase in corporate offices opening in my area, and they all were PPO. And so basically a lot of new patients were flocking to the corporate offices to save money. Patients in our area experienced excessive reduction in their home values, and they were fairly new homes. So a lot of them were upside down, and a lot of people lost their jobs in our area. So we were just finding a way to survive at that point.
That's tough. So your first practice, then, how many operatories was it?
We started out with 4 when I opened, it was 2, and then we went to 4, and then we had nowhere to put emergencies. And that's when we realized, oh my gosh, this is great. We need more room. So I was able to expand my location, but about 3 months after the expansion is when the recession really kind of hit us. So we had 3 good months, and then it just, went down from there.
And so how many ops did that end up being after the expansion?
Altogether, I had 7.
Okay.
And room for one more. So I have 8 operatories currently in that location, but the 8th one is really just being used for storage, because we've never hit the growth spurt that we originally had.
Gotcha. Okay, so now let's fast forward to let's get back to that time before you bought that fee-for-service practice. So a couple more things about the practice you purchased. How many operatories? You said it was 1 doctor chair and 1 hygiene. So
yes.
How many ops did the actual location have?
Altogether, there were 4, but only 3 chairs in existence. The 4th one was being used as a dark room.
Okay. And in your opinion, it's something that I think is important whenever you're entertaining the idea of buying a fee-for-service practice, is understanding why they were able to sustain or be fee-for-service. So in your opinion, looking at that practice you purchased, what about it made you think that they were able to survive as a fee-for-service practice?
I actually have thought about this quite a bit, because we actually did the exact same thing. I took my model of growth from my first practice and just moved it over to the already built practice. And I said, well, if I do a lot of advertising, and if I stick to the way I treatment planned originally, and I'm just not taking all these insurance write-offs, it should be a breeze. But it did not go that way. So it turns out we actually lost quite a bit of patients before they even came through our door. And the reason was that a lot of them had moved to different areas of the city and were specifically coming to that practice for that one doctor that they had been with for 8 years. So when we came in, a lot of them said, well, I drive really far. If I'm going to meet a new dentist, I'd rather meet a new dentist closer to where I live. So I would say we probably lost a good 20% of patients just for that reason, which was astonishing to me. I did not see that coming.
So you did not actually, you moved and you went to that facility. You didn't bring all of his patients to your first practice, right?
No, I physically was driving an hour away to a a higher end demographic to this particular location that I had picked out because of the demographics were better.
So, okay, so you were under the idea that, okay, I'm buying this practice in this very nice area, and so I'm going to drive an hour and see those patients in their area, hoping that they'll stay, and 20% of them left.
Yes.
Okay, but the seller beforehand, so do you feel like it was the relationship he had with his patients that allowed him to stay fee-for-service, or what about what he did before allowed him to thrive as a fee-for-service practice?
I think about the fact that they had opened 8 years earlier. So it goes back to the thought of, well, gosh, that's kind of when I opened. It's like they opened before the crash. And so I think what they had done is, because it was on a smaller scale than my other practice, I don't think the recession hit them as bad, but also because it was a wealthier community and it was a more established community. So I think they were able to retain more patients. And also the community was, like I said, it was wealthy, but these were not people that were dependent on their insurance to get treatment. So if you've never really had to deal with insurance and you've never had dental coverage and you've just always paid for your treatment, I just think it was a different type of patient that was just used to paying for their bills. They didn't even say, gosh, well, I don't know if I'm going to get this or that done because I don't know if my insurance is going to cover it. That group of people out there, they did not have that issue.
Okay. So now you went into the practice and then 20% of them left because they were going for that specific reason. Did anybody say that they left because there was a new doctor and not because they lived far?
I wouldn't say I know that answer for sure because I wasn't taking all the phone calls, but I'm sure that we probably lost some people that way.
Okay. So what happened? So was that pretty immediate, the 20% drop?
That was over the first year. So say if I purchased the practice with 1,000 patients and then we say, okay, well, after the first year, we're down to 800 patients. That's a pretty easy way to figure out we lost about 20 patients over that year because it would be around the time they would be due for their recall. And so we'd make a call and, we had sent a lot of promotional stuff out about, we're here and this is our background and this is our second location and we have a lot of experience, and it didn't translate into bringing the patients back. Now, some of them came, but another problem that we had with the transition is that it was a small staff and we lost 2 staff members within the first 6 months. So that's 75% of the staff were gone because it was only a staff of 4 if you counted the person running the front desk that was married to the dentist. So 75% of the office was gone and we were left with 1 assistant.
So between the 4 existing staff members, one of them being the wife of the seller's wife and 2 other individuals left?
Yes. One of the hygienists, well, she was the only hygienist. She actually said she wanted to go back and get a different degree. She said she was going to leave hygiene altogether. So I don't know what her long-term background was or how long she had been a hygienist, but she just said, well, I think I want to do something different now. So
within the first 6 months, then pretty much 3 of the 4 existing staff members left, and that's a lot of change, I guess, to happen in a short period of time.
Right, and I'm sure that doesn't help with trying to maintain patients either.
Okay, so then over the course of the first year, there was a 20% drop, and then what happened after that?
The issue that I had also was keeping dentists long term because the landscape for hiring associates is different. I think it's hard for an associate to come in with the amount of debt that a lot of associates have these days, and they can't afford to sit and grow a practice, even though I did offer anybody that came in, I said, there's a very good chance that you could buy in, buy out. This was not something that I felt I had to hold on to forever. So my thoughts were, even if I could grow the practice with an associate that would like to buy in, I still had trouble keeping associates.
I mentioned in a previous episode that one of our biggest issues right now as young dentists and dental students is our student loan debt. It is one of the main reasons why we strive at Shared Practices to navigate the path to successful practice ownership. We aim to help our audience by doing everything we can to help you earn a great income as a dentist. It has always been my advice to tackle your student loan debt by refinancing your loans after becoming a practice owner with a stable income. Doing this allows you to avoid paying too much on your monthly interest. The key to refinancing your loans is selecting an experienced lender that will offer you a competitive interest rate. Did you know that most student loans charge the same rate regardless of how creditworthy you are? So chances are, as dentists, you're probably paying too much in monthly interest. Laurel Road, a division of Darien Rowan Bank, is a national leader in student lending. Laurel Road has helped medical professionals across the country refinance their federal and private dental school debt, saving thousands on interest over the life of their loans. Not only do they offer great terms and great service, ADA members receive an additional 0.25% rate discount on top of their new and already low rate for as long as they remain an ADA member. Fill out a 2-minute application and get pre-approved rates instantly if you are eligible. It's free to apply and there's no obligation to accept. For more information specific to your needs as a dentist and to submit an application, simply visit www.laurelroad.com/sharedpractices. Again, that is LAURELROAD.com/sharedpractices. Laurel Road is an equal housing and opportunity lender. All rates are subject to eligibility. Savings may vary. This is a paid promotion of student loan refinancing by Laurel Road. Okay, so in the 5 years, if you don't mind me asking, in the 5 years, I guess going on 6 now, that you've had that second location, how many associates have practiced in that location?
In that location, I had 4.
Okay. That's not like alarming. I think that's pretty standard for just associates in general. But I think, like you said, it's just kind of the inherent turnover. And so after the 20% drop in patients that first year for, whatever reason, was there an increase in patients over time, or what ended up happening? Did you have to take insurance plans, or how did you manage that situation?
We did. We actually, what we decided we would do is we would pick a couple of our better paying plans, and we said, hey, let's take a couple of these better paying plans and see if we can at least get the volume up a little bit. And the overall numbers just didn't grow. So I could still see new patients, but my revenue was not as good because I was collecting, 20 to 30% less with the new fee schedule. So it wasn't a good mix. I couldn't find the right balance to make that location work. And I put a lot of money into advertising. And if you sent out a more high-end brochure with a high-end look, you might get a few calls. And then so we thought, well, maybe we need to go for the bargain shoppers and things like that. And we found with the bargain shoppers, they were not repeat clients. They would come in, they would want to get their free cleaning or their reduced price cleaning and their second opinions and things like that, but they weren't staying long-term patients. And so it was hard finding something that worked in that location. And it just never grew.
Okay, so today, so many years from that initial acquisition, what is the status of that? Is it the same kind of status where you have that one location and you have the insurance plans and you're trying to grow it?
No, actually, I closed that practice at the end of May of this year. So it's no longer my practice. I actually ended up selling the patient list to another local dentist who basically I basically transferred all the records, and I sold that as a percentage of what she collects from those patients over the next 3 years.
Okay, so that's a pretty common way of selling your charts. So how do
Right.
you feel about that? Maybe take us through your thoughts in doing that, and maybe why you decided to sell the charts and kind of move on from that location.
That location, just when my lease was up, I thought, well, I either have to move the practice to maybe somewhere where I can get a little bit more visibility. I wasn't in a super visible location. You kind of had to search for the practice. So I didn't have a lot of signage. There was a lot of rules I was in a professional building. There was a lot of rules related to our building. So I thought, well, I'm going to start looking for a more visible location. And then I also tried to look to do a merger with another small office, and I couldn't make any of that work. And so when my landlord basically said, hey, we need another lease or we're going to put it back up to rent, I just said, okay, I'm going to close it, because I just did not want to sign another 5-year lease.
Okay, and looking back at the experience, did the practice, so from the time you bought it to the time you sold it, was it the size of revenue or collections, was it about the same?
No, actually it went down. It went down significantly. I would say I lost probably 35% of revenue from the time I bought the practice until the time I sold the practice.
Okay. And, for anybody so looking back on the experience, if you had to advise somebody to look at a fee-for-service practice to buy, or just any practice, what were the takeaways, like looking back at it, 7 months from the time you sold the practice, what were your major takeaways?
Number one, I probably would not even buy another fee-for-service practice unless I were to do a slow buy-in or a partnership leading to buyout, only because it's a lot to pay for an existing practice, and there's not a guarantee that you're going to be able to keep it at the same level of production that the original owner had. What's interesting is I started a practice from scratch, which means I paid less to open the doors, and I was able to surpass my second location. I was able to surpass from zero to double what this other office was making in such a much shorter time than it was to buy a practice and try to make it keep growing. I don't know what the reason was overall, but it just seemed like it was a better bargain for me when I started a practice than it was to buy something on possibly goodwill that people are going to keep coming through the door.
That's a good point. And I think maybe would you agree if I said that buying a fee-for-service practice, it's a little bit more volatile in that, if you bought, let's just say you bought that practice and they took insurance. Do you think that more people would have stayed and it would have been maybe a smoother transition?
I almost think that people are a little bit married to where this place takes my insurance. I think there's a different mindset today compared to, say, 10 years ago, where people are insurance hoppers now. I call them boomerang patients, because having had my primary location for almost 16 years, we have patients that leave, oh, my insurance just switched, I got to leave. And then they're back in 18 months or 24 months or 36 months because, oh, now my insurance has changed again. Now I'm back here. So I think people follow the insurance now more than they follow the provider. I mean, they'll even say to us, we loved coming here. We loved everything about the place, but I've got to go where my insurance is taken. So I just don't think there's as much loyalty to the provider as there used to be. And there's more loyalty to the insurance plan.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that's a very honest answer. And I think you have a unique perspective in that you've had a practice that was fee-for-service that you started, and then you now are no longer fee-for-service, and then you bought a fee-for-service practice also. So I think you have a very unique understanding of maybe how it is being a provider in both environments. Were there any other challenges that you faced buying that fee-for-service practice that we haven't talked about so far?
I would say the other thing that's really tricky when you buy a practice in an area where the demographics look appealing. The other issue that I had that was very significant that I had not counted on was that the patients are, in my demographic, I had multimillionaires. The problem with finding staff is most people who work in a dental office cannot afford to live in the same areas where multimillionaires live. So staff generally had to travel quite a bit to come to the office. And so I had a lot of trouble keeping staff and finding good staff. And, if you have to replace staff, you have to recruit people from 30, 45-hour drives. People are commuting to this location. So that means you have to pay them enough to compensate for the fact that they're spending a lot of time in their cars. It's hard for them. And I think that was another big issue. So we had a lot of turnover in the first year or two until I finally figured out, gosh, when I find somebody good, I really have to make it worth their while to stay with this kind of job where they're, when you're driving in a city in traffic 45 minutes a day, somebody's got to make it worth your while.
I think that's a great point. And I think there's cities that are, I think, laid out differently where, some cities, maybe a higher end demographic is like a little close to maybe a demographic where you could find people to work for you. And I think others that distance is very far. So I guess in your case, that was probably a far drive for you to have, where maybe your staff was living.
Yes, it was a coastal community. And so on one entire side of the town is the ocean. So you can't recruit from east. You can only recruit from west. And if you're coming north or south and you're driving along these coastal roads, it takes you forever to get down into those communities. That
makes sense. And it even took you a long time, right, to get to work when you were working over there?
Yes, it was, like I said, it was an hour drive if there wasn't any accidents. So, but I was traveling from one entire side of Jacksonville to the entire opposite side. So I didn't mind the drive, but I was the one with everything invested. So
that makes sense.
The staff doesn't see it that way.
And so let's go back to your first location for a little bit. So when you sold in May, when you sold the second practice, I'm assuming that you had an associate working for you at the time, and there was kind of the two of you bouncing back and forth. Is that how it was when you sold it?
Yes.
Okay, so then what happened with the associate? Did they move full-time to your first practice, or did you have to let them go? Or
what I had to do is I had to cut her down to 2 days a week from 4. And I had attempted to find a position for her with some friends of mine in the community. Nothing really panned out, and she ended up actually leaving the state. She was great, but I just couldn't justify the cost of keeping her 4 days. So what's sad is if I had found her first, I think things could have turned out differently, but what happened is in the past, and I can only focus on, what's going forward.
Now you're back full-time in one office. How has it been, that transition from 1 to 2 and then back from 2 to 1?
I actually am grateful. It wasn't immediate that I felt grateful, but I will admit that I had a great sense of relief the day that I walked out of the second location, the last the last time I walked out the door and I locked the door, I felt relief right at that moment, because there's a lot involved in owning 2 practices, and everything that you think is a headache when you have 1 practice, it doubles, but the time that you have in a 24-hour period doesn't double. So it was not the way I had planned for all of it to happen, but looking back, I'm better off with 1 location now. I wouldn't do a second location now. Even if I found the best practice on the planet, I would not do a second location.
Can you elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, you think that, okay, I've figured out these systems, I know how to work a practice, and all I have to do is duplicate it, and it's going to be easy, because you think it's going to be less work to have a second one than a first one, but it isn't. It's the same amount of work, because you have, in my case, I had 2 corporations. So I've got 2 sets of corporate taxes to do. I've got 2 sets of staff. I've got two payrolls. I've got, everything that you do on a regular basis, you still have to be somewhat involved in, because if you're not at least paying attention to these things, that's when things go really wrong. So the hiring, the firing, the supplies, everything that has to even just, you have to be cognizant of all these things, even if you're not doing them personally. You just have to pay attention to them. So it's just, there's no free time. I think if you don't want to have a great family life, I travel a lot. So, you can't travel a lot with 2 locations, because stuff's going to go wrong when you're gone, and you're going to be getting the calls and the texts and all that when you go away. And it's just, it was more than I thought it would be once I had lived through it.
And if you don't mind me asking, it's very common that people get 2 locations. It's not like it was an original idea. So I'm not like, but what made you want to? What about the idea of 2 was attractive to you in the first place?
I think because I had gotten used to a certain level of income when my first practice grew so fast. And I was just really looking for a second revenue stream. And I just thought, well, why don't I do this again? And I'm going to be able to increase my income by having another practice. So not only did that not happen, but I ended up losing money. So you could call it being adventurous, or you could call it being greedy. I don't know, but but the money aside, had I even been profitable, the time that it took to me wasn't worth the trade-off of, even if I had been more profitable, it is draining to run a second location when, you have a family and you have friends, and you have to say no to a lot of things that normally people could say yes to if they weren't managing 2 practices.
So if you don't mind me asking, were you buying 2 with the intention of 3 or 4, or were you just buying 2 with the intention of staying with 2 and just doubling your income?
Yeah, I didn't even have the fantasy of doubling my income, but I thought, if I could replace the income that had been lost after the recession, which wasn't doubling it, but it was about a 30%. I lost about a 30% income after the recession. So I thought, well, if I could make this up by having this other location, and then I would be building double equity. So the thoughts were, well, if I look at a long-term plan for, okay, what is my net income, my net worth going to be 20 years from now? Well, my net worth will be double, because everything will be, you're going to be looking at 2 practices instead of 1 when it's time to sell. So.
Gotcha. So you weren't looking at it in the sense of, you weren't going to go like more than 2. You were just planning on staying with 2 practices even before you started.
Yeah, I I didn't really want to manage more than 2.
Okay. And if you want me asking, you don't have to give me numbers because that's uncomfortable, but I think we can infer that the time in your career where you had the highest income was before the recession, when you had the 1 thriving practice that was fully fee-for-service. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, and I don't mind discussing numbers, because I really think, especially for young dentists, they need to know the reality of it. I think part of the problem with young dentists today is all the guys that are killing it out there and making the really big hundreds of thousands in dentistry, they're the ones tooting their horns. And the guys that are like, I know a lot of dentists that have been dentists for a long time, and they don't make more than $150,000 a year. And I think when a student gets out of school and they hear, oh gosh, this person's making $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year, that's not the average. At the time that my first practice was collecting $100,000 a month, I mean, you can do the math. And that was within just a few years of opening the doors. So, I was around 1.3 million when I hit my highest. And then we basically went down to I'm trying to think if it was within 3 years, we were still hovering right around 800,000. So that's a big difference. So when you look at those numbers and you say, gosh, why would somebody want a second location? Well, gosh, because I was doing 1.3 million and now I'm doing 800,000. If I buy this practice over here, that's it's a $500,000 of revenue. Well, there's your 1.3 million right there, but I would still have room to grow both of them. So that was my logic at the time. Did it work out like that? No, but that was the logic.
As we wrap up Season 2 of the Shared Practices podcast and conclude our discussion about acquisitions, I wanted to share a project that I've been working on for quite some time. A lot of the experiences that I've been able to share on the podcast are a direct result of people who have been reaching out to me for the last couple years with help finding, analyzing, and ultimately getting into practice ownership. I've learned a ton from these experiences, and I've had the great fortune of looking at hundreds of dental practices for sale. Now, something that I have been working on is an ebook to chronicle my experience and some of the key lessons that I've learned and ultimately designed and created the Ownership Accelerator. I think it's through these people's experiences that you can really see a lot of the things that go into an acquisition, maybe behind the scenes or from my perspective. And so today I'm excited to announce the release of my ebook, Keys to Buying the Right Dental Practice, explained using real stories with real buyers. I go through each chapter talking about a specific experience I had with a buyer and the lesson that relates to the process of buying a dental practice. In the 9th chapter, I talk about how to start your career off on the right foot and ultimately the genesis of the Ownership Accelerator. I think it's a great read and it's very candid through my own perspective on my experiences dealing with buyers, and you'll be able to see a little bit how it works on the back end, me getting emails, my thoughts as I'm going through it, and I try to be as open and honest as possible while still preserving the buyers involved confidentiality. They've all agreed to share their experiences, and so I'm super excited to announce the release of my ebook. If you want to download it, you can download it for free at book.sharedpractices.com. Again, that is book.sharedpractices.com. I'm super excited, and I hope you download a copy and read my book, Keys to Buying the Right Dental Practice, explained using real stories with real buyers. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the show notes. And if you don't mind me asking, I'm assuming, so I'm going to put 3 time frames here. So you have after the recession, before you bought your second location, you have your income at that point. So that would be around 2010, and then maybe 2014, right in the middle of the 2 locations. And then now, December of 2017, what, if you had to, what would your income be in those 3 situations? So let's put aside the one that we know is correct, your highest income with the fee-for-service practice that's thriving. But in those other 3, how do they rank?
Are you talking about, I think I'm misunderstanding the question. So if I combine the revenues of the 2 practices.
Oh, no, I'm asking about your actual personal take-home. How much are you living on, or how much do you have to, take home for your efforts? I think the point I'm trying to maybe show our audience is the notion that I think, if I had to guess, and you could tell me if I'm wrong, I would think that right now, being back in your first location, having sold off the second one, I think that you'd be making more money now with less stress than you were before you did that.
That is exactly right. You are exactly right. And I have actually seen a significant, I've only been in my current practice full-time since the beginning of October, and that's because I took a few months of only working 2 days for a few months after I closed the second location because I needed a mental break.
Yeah,
so
I'd imagine.
I wasn't going heavy at the dentistry until I actually took over 2 weeks off in September where I did no dentistry. I went to Europe. I said, I just need a mental break. So I came back in October ready to kick it. And I really improved my primary location significantly the first 2 months that I've been back. So now that I've had a little attitude adjustment, I think I'm probably functioning better in one location. So I'm sure I can make up this revenue at some point, but it's going to take a little bit of time to make up for my losses, and that's just what it is. I'll get a little bit of money from the transition where I transferred my patients over to the other office, and I'm just hoping that minimizes my losses from the. I'll never get back the years that I spent, but I just want to minimize my financial losses and make up for it pretty quickly because, I'm not a spring chicken, and I'm hoping to only be in dentistry maybe 10 more years at the most.
Okay. And, I really appreciate your honesty. I think, I think our audience is getting so much out of this. I'd hope, I think your honesty has a lot to do with that. So I really do appreciate it. I don't think this is easy to, talk about, especially, if it didn't go as planned. But I really commend you for, taking the time and, talking to us. Do you have anything else for our audience that you want to impart on them?
Yeah, I really think what's tough for a new dentist, and I can actually even remind myself occasionally what that was like, even though it was more than 20 years ago. The best thing you can do when you're starting out is to learn as much as you can and not take for granted that you know everything, because every office, even if it's not a good experience, there's things you can learn from it. So I was in practice for 8 years before I even opened my own office, and I worked everything from health department to DMO type corporate to high-end private practice to PPOs. I did all these things, and then I just picked what is it that I want to do in dentistry. But I learned so much from every single one of those experiences. But one thing I really learned is what I don't want to do in dentistry. And I think it's hard when you're coming out of a dental school program where everything is treatment planned, Ivy Tower, to realize that's not real world dentistry. So it's just a matter of finding what you want to do without, I think there's a lot of glamorization of dentistry as a field. And I don't think it's as glamorous as it seems when you're walking through the halls of dental school.
Gotcha. And do you think that growth is non-clinical and clinical, or what areas would you have, would you focus on if you were a young dentist graduating dental school again?
I would actually focus on, obviously your clinical skills are necessary, but I think they undervalue people skills. And if I had to give people advice that are young, I'd say, first of all, read a lot about finance in general. Don't get yourself in a ton of debt. They're already walking out with astronomical debt these days, but don't get so hung up on spending early in your career, because when you're 20 years in, I think most people after 20-something years in a career, they look back and they go, I could have not really spent that money there, and I could have saved more. And then that gives you more freedom as you get older. So I think managing their money, managing patients, reading about personalities of people. Dentistry is so multidimensional. It's not just treating the MOD or the full crown or the inlay. That's not really the whole business of dentistry. You've got the patient's attitudes and personalities, you've got the staff's attitudes and personalities, then you've got the financial aspect, and then you've got this little corner where nobody knows if your MOD is good or not.
I think that's a great point. And I really appreciate you. It's kind of the whole point of our podcast, to be honest. Our whole podcast is centered around non-clinical parts of dentistry, like the business of owning a practice and whatnot. So, yeah, I think, obviously we feel that's important. So I'm glad you, after 20 years, would have that advice to give a new grad. I really do. I think that almost justifies what we do. But
yeah.
So anyway, I really appreciate you coming on again. I think your honesty was really, really awesome to hear. And I know our audience got a lot out of this. So I really do appreciate you coming on. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much.
Very welcome.
Okay, that was awesome, because I feel like Stephanie really opened up to us and shared what could have been, a painful experience to share, but she was very open and honest about what she'd gone through. So what were the things that stood out to you, George?
Well, I think, to kind of go on your point, I think the candor, this is pretty fresh. I didn't realize how fresh it was until, I had done the interview. I'm like, wow, it's pretty recent for her to be talking about it. But also, I think two things.
Was it 6 months ago, or how long ago did she sell that second one?
Yeah, like very recently, like 6 months ago, I think, or less than 6 months. Very, very recent. She sold that second one, and she like, I barely took time off and got back into it. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
But I think the, when you think about the staff turnover, I think we talked about that in the first two parts, and I wanted to contrast it. So in the first two episodes of this 3-part series, both doctors had their staff stay on for extended period of time, or if like Drew's hygienist left, it was a big party, explaining why.
Sure.
In her case, she came in and 75% of her staff gone right away. And so naturally that's a big change right up front. And especially with the fee-for-service practice, that's amplifying that change. The second thing that I noticed was she had an associate covering, they were going between two offices. And I think for a fee-for-service practice, having an associate's tough, because it's that relationship-based, like you had talked to me about before the outro, but then also, there's turnover there. And, I think fee-for-service practices are a little bit more sensitive to turnover. And so I think those two things stood out to me. What stood out to you?
Well, just the inherent risk in fee-for-service, in the fact that you're going to lose a size of your patient base. And the question is how much. It's not a question of whether or not it's going to happen. You're going to lose some of your patients in any transition, but more in a fee-for-service, and even more when you have things like turnover, when people are commuting a long ways, when other factors come into play. And so that's so hard, because you've paid a price for the practice, and now your revenue has instantly dropped. Whereas like a lot of the things that we've tried to highlight in this season are finding practices that have immediate upside. And so you're paying a lower price, but you can add value right away. It's the other way around. It's like buying a car and you drive it off the lot and instantly you've lost $5,000, so that's just the risk. And so it's knowing and understanding and mitigating that risk. But sometimes it doesn't work out the way that you wanted it to. So that was one takeaway for me. And then the other is just I could hear the relief. I thought it was really good that you kind of highlighted that in her experience in getting rid of that second practice. It's kind of like there's only so much you can do if you've got a podcast and a residency and a spouse who gets a job halfway through while you're doing all that. Like, you have to either bring on a partner or quit, or both, which is kind of what I've done. So it's that multiple locations, it feels like this dream come true. And she is not the only person I know personally that has done the multiple location thing and is not happy with it and has had to close down an office, and it was painful. But when they did it, they're glad they did and would never own multiple locations again. So I think a lot of our crowd and potentially audience in our generation of kind of like the ambitious dental students kind of have that in their sights. And it's really good to hear that tempered with someone's actual experience of, yeah, sure, you can expand to 7 practices, but it might just kill you along the way, and it's not always worth it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways I had. I kind of told in an interview, I would guess that your income was much higher with a single location than it ever was with 2.
Yeah.
And, I think I told her after the interview, my feedback and what I'm going to talk about in the outro is that, I think to go the route of multiple locations has to be intentional. And I find so many people just kind of back their way into it. Oh, there was another practice, so I just bought it. But I think you need to if you're going to have more than one, you need to have a reason and a plan for how you're going to handle it and what you're going to do maybe to get rid of them. Because I think to just have multiple over a long period of time, maybe, I don't know if that would be the best thing. I wouldn't always recommend it that way. I would recommend having multiple for a purpose. something that you're trying to
have
accomplish.
Exit strategies, just like real estate. You buy a property with like, okay, I could rent this or I could sell it, and either one would work out to my advantage. Same thing with a second office. I'm buying this with A and B as my two plans for it.
Exactly. And, we don't talk about multiple practices a whole lot, but I think there's like this no man's land of numbers of practices. And I think somewhere between like 2 to 4 is kind of in no man's land a little bit of, you're not big enough to delegate enough out to make it worth it, I think. And
to have that second layer of administration.
Exactly. And so, she was doing everything herself versus, had she quickly gone up to more, she could have afforded somebody to help her with the load. But either way, I think it's tough. And I think we saw a great perspective here on kind of a Justin Short philosophy. When he had 2 practices, he sold one and focused on his single practice, and that created a lot more income success and better lifestyle. So I think that was reflected here in this episode.
The other thing that just kind of came to mind as we were talking about this is that I think fee for service is inherently less scalable than PPO because of the issues that we talked about with turnover. And so to have multiple fee for service offices, you'd have to be creating a culture and a feel and very high touch, high attention to all of those little things that are harder to manage and harder to transfer and harder to replicate. And so I think she ran into some of that as well, just by nature of having 2 offices and trying to retain patients at both offices and maintain all that. It's something I hadn't really thought about, but if you are going to do fee for service, it sounds like you just got to perfect that one practice and drive it home. And there are guys who have done multiple fee for service offices, but I think that is even more an exception than the norm.
Oh yeah. And I think, Peter's way of doing it, buying 2 offices and merging them under one roof is I think the best way to make something like that work.
Sure.
But I think, again, focusing on that single location, especially with the fee for service, is I think a good idea.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, this has been great. I love different perspectives that are kind of counter to what is easiest to talk about. And so I've loved having Dr. Stephanie Mapp on, and then as well as the 2 previous interviews. So thank you, George, for setting these up and doing these interviews for anyone looking at fee for service. And hopefully we've answered a lot of questions around that. But if people have more questions or more thoughts, like we've got a Facebook group that we'd love to dive into all these issues on. So join us on the Facebook group, get on the email list. We've got a lot of great resources. George, you've even got potentially like an ebook coming out. So there's a lot going on, and we want to help. We want to be a community. So definitely get involved and reach out to us.
Awesome. Thanks again for listening to the Shared Practices podcast.
See ya.